Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus. My co-founder and co-host for the past 4 years, Phyllis Zimbler-Miller, is stepping back from this podcast to focus on several book projects. I will soon be announcing a new co-host to this show. The Jewish people have been hated and persecuted throughout the centuries. After the Holocaust and after the founding of Israel, we hoped that would end. After October 7, we hoped it would end. But the hatred against Israel and Jews is only rising, opening old scars and creating new ones. What is it that feeds this eternal hatred? And how can we counter it more effectively? I'll discuss this with our guest, Toba Hellerstein. She writes blogs in the Times of Israel, and she recently performed amazing research on current narratives about Israel and Jews and how to change them. She's the founder and CEO of Attune Now, a strategic advisory firm specializing in research-driven communication strategies. Toba, welcome, and thank you so much for coming on our podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, in your blog in Times of Israel of March 6, you wrote about what you call the Jewish trauma trap. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
So, the Jewish trauma trap is this unconscious pattern that we fall into where it's trauma and not strategy that drives our communications. So, what do I mean by this? Strategy in communications means understanding your audience. It's attuning to your audience. Who are they? What do they think about? What are they afraid of? What do they value? And how do I communicate them in a way that meets them where they are? So communications requires leaving oneself and focusing on the audience. But trauma makes us fall into two sort of types of traps. One is what trauma does with individuals and then with cultures and collectives of peoples over time, which we really see for our people, is in order to self-protect, vulnerability becomes very dangerous. And so what this means is people focus on practical, hyper-intellectualization, rational, concrete things because the emotional experience is extremely painful. Humans are really bad at compartmentalizing emotions. It's sort of like you're online or you're not as online. So what this means is we struggle to communicate in an emotionally resonant way with people. And in order to be seen and to be known, it requires this self-revelation, this self-disclosure of this is what we're afraid of, this is why, it's explaining who we are as people as opposed to saying this is what we have done and this is sort of the line. So that's the first part, is this hyper intellectualization and lack of vulnerability and emotional resonance. But the other side of this is that when we do engage in emotions around communications with non-Jews, it ends up being more cathartic. So it's like, I'm angry, I'm in pain, and you hear that anger and that pain as maybe I'm yelling at you because you've said something horrible, or I'm trying to like implore you and explain because it doesn't seem like you're getting it, right? So there's a lot of emotion in that, but it's not emotional release is not the same thing as emotional resonance. So the trauma trap is often either we're struggling to be in the emotions, either we go sterile and we go hyper intellectual, or the trap would be we're in the emotions, but we're not in the emotions in a way that invites in the audience and builds a bridge and connects to them. We're in the emotions in a way that, and I'm all for catharsis, but catharsis should be done closed door. That's what Jews do with other Jews, right? This is like the support and hand holding and being seen, and like that's something we have to do amongst ourselves. And it's so important. But when we're doing communications or when we're doing advocacy or when we're working with non-Jewish people, we have to figure out like, is my goal right now to emotionally release something, or is my goal to invite you in and to change hearts and minds? Um, and so I think this educational mode that we go into of facts and statistics, it often comes across as cold and detached. And this feeds into these negative stereotypes. So we see this a lot for Israel communications when you see Israeli spokespeople who are really focused on like proving the point, proving, of course, we had to do this because of X, Y, and Z. And we have this feeling like if you could really see why we had to do this, like if you could really see this action, you would really get it. But it comes across often as cold and detached, which feeds into these ideas of, you know, uncaring or callousness. And so being able to speak as a human, whether you're in an official capacity or not, and showing your cards of, we're doing this because we're terrified. This is why, this is how it felt for us, the emotional experience. What I often see, I see interviews of people, not necessarily governmental, it could just be advocates. And often I'll see an interviewer ask them, what was it like for you on October 7th? And almost always they don't answer. Instead of saying, I didn't hear from my son for 12 hours and I thought I had lost or I thought I lost the love of my life. Like instead of telling this revealing human story, what I usually hear is a shifting into the intellectual of, well, this is a culmination over the course of years and this is what they did, right? It's still, and so even when we're given the opportunity to emotionally connect, we really struggle with it. So, so flattened affect is something I talk a lot about. So it's pain expressed through intellect instead of emotion. Um, Emotional honesty, so emotional release is different than emotional impact. So the truth has to be felt in order to be received. That's what's really important around this. And so,
Mm.
and the solution is not performance because humans, most Americans know very little, if nothing, about Israel or the region. But humans are really smart emotionally. Even if they don't know exactly what you're doing that doesn't feel quite right, something doesn't sit well. So anything that's performative or trying to really prove pain, it often backfires. And so like this authentic emotional presence is really this winning combination, like letting yourself be seen, not defending. But so as I was saying, so this is the trauma trap. Another aspect for the trauma trap is so many of the negative perceptions and stereotypes of Jews are traits that are have a nugget of truth, but are totally taken out of context and exaggerated. And the nugget of truth is almost always a normal trauma response that you see of any number of individuals or different societies, really normal. So for example, if things are chronically seized and taken away from you, you develop scarcity mentality. And if you were to vilify scarcity mentality, you would probably call it greed, right? If you have the experience of, constantly being pushed out from country to country, you would want to develop more support in your community and have a lot of loyalty to your community. Totally understandable. But if you want to vilify that, that's dual loyalty, right? So all of these traits and what ends up happening is because these are, often conspiratorial, vicious stereotypes, what you often find as well, which is related to trauma trap, is that we will try to say that there's no truth at all to what people are noticing, but that doesn't ring true to people because every culture does have collections of traits that are more or less common. That's just whoever were biggest personalities in culture at pivotal moments or where people came from. Like cultures look different, right? And so I think, being able to own some distinctness, but dispelling the conspiratorial vilification side is really important. But once again, that requires a vulnerability that's very difficult to do in a culture that's formed by trauma.
So, for instance, if they say to me, "You Jews, you're all rich,"
Hmm.
then what should I say?
So I think this, and this is the trait, I mean, this is the thing with anti-Semitism, right? It's all about contradictions. So simultaneously, Jews are really rich, or maybe Jews are like the great unwashed that are a strain on society. It kind of depends on the country you're in, it depends on the era. In terms of when we think about, say, anti-Semitism, what we're looking at, and wealth in particular, this is an interesting one. We're looking at, what are society's grievances that are then reflected onto the Jews for scapegoating, right? So this is why we're subject of all these contradictory ideas of like really strong but really weak, victim or perpetrator. We're both somehow, right? And I think what we see is anytime there's a when you see this broad brush of like Jews are really wealthy or Jews are really rich, it really depends on the tone and it depends on often on demographics. So, for example, in my research, Black Americans are much more likely to associate wealth and Jews with conspiratorial thinking of Jews hoarding resources. So, but in for Latinos in the US, it's much more likely to be a positive trait of like, this is, if I think you're wealthy, it's because I think you worked really hard and I admire hard work. So this is what's sort of tricky about some of these tropes and stereotypes is it does depend on the context and the energy that it's coming from. Because if someone says, you Jews are rich in this like this anti-elitism way, that's conspiratorial. But if people say,
So, what
man,
should I
Jews are,
say then? What should I say if it's in that way?
if it's in that way, I mean, I think so. This requires a bit of an honest conversation. Like, would you say that in America you are wealthy? Because so, for example, this is what I'm saying. It requires an honest revelation if you want to engage. So if someone says to me, I won't put you on the spot. I'll answer for myself, okay? So if someone says, Toba, you're rich, all of these Jews are rich. You know, for me, what I would do some self-revelation of in America, I'm probably upper middle class. My family, we didn't have industries that made us really profitable. It was a lot of education and hard work. Um, I do think that our culture values education and hard work, and I think that in societies that are meritocracies, that does reward and that is really profitable. But also, I know in my family, education was valued far more than wealth. And so what I did there is not only did I reveal something of myself, so I made this a vulnerable moment, right? Because if someone's saying something about me, it's really easy to like to debate them on the conspiracy removing oneself. But the whole point with anti-Semitism is it's about Jews as a symbol as opposed to individuals. So always being able to bring yourself and your story and your family stories as much as possible in this honest way. And then the other thing is, and this is more important, I think, is I'm showing behind the curtain. Like you're seeing something, let's say Jews are really represented in finance or in Hollywood, whatever it is. There's truth to that. We know there's truth to that. But what people miss is the reasons why it's true. So, for example, let's say I was in banking and someone says, you Jews are so rich, you hoard all of the money, all of you bankers. What I would do there is talk about, yeah, like we didn't want to get into banking. We weren't allowed to own land in Europe, and this was the only profession available to us, and it was illegal to lend money. So we were just trying to survive, and this is a career that ended up being really profitable nowadays, but it wasn't that profitable before. And so I'm giving you information, but I'm not educating you quite as much as I'm allowing you to trust me in an emotional narrative that humanizes. So the whole idea for all of this is I want you to experience me and Jewish people as complex, contradictory, imperfect people, normal people. And so, trying to something that I think we do a lot of is, well, I want to counteract anti-Semitism by showing all these great achievements we've done for the world, like civil rights and Tikkun Olam and all these innovations. And we think that's really helpful. But everyone else just hears that as us being arrogant and bragging. And so and so for them, what they always want to know is who are you? What drives you? Not what have I done? So hopefully that helped as an answer.
Yes, yes. What I found interesting in your blog was your observation that whatever we Jews do and did in over time in history to react to anti-Semitism, to save ourselves in an environment of anti-Semitism, is then the way we survive is also something they hold against us,
That's right.
right? Uh, could you give some more examples of that, please?
Yeah, so we talked about this a little bit earlier, but if you are in a situation where you're being persecuted by your neighbors and pushed from country to country. We talked about this like developing a really strong communal system where maybe we trade amongst ourselves, we protect ourselves, we advocate for one another. So that sort of loyalty that comes from trying to survive in a world where we can't trust our neighbors because our neighbors were were dangerous in some way. And I think and we talked about scarcity as well in terms of, if everything's taken from you, learning to be resourceful and scrappy and things like that. So you also have the power hungry Jew. So this is like, we are a tiny group. So we will never have the majority. So the only way to have protection is to cozy up to powerful people, right? And so this is why you always find like Jewish advisors of any given like king. And then nowadays in the US, you'll see Jews who are pretty well positioned on both political sides. But this is a strategy, right? Because we'll always be in the minority. Um, Another one is the secretive Jew. So this is the trauma of forced hiding. So if you are going to be persecuted for being Jewish, you want to maybe not share much about your traditions. You don't want to share much about your practices or what your community is doing because you're fearful that it would be used against you. So then you end up being secretive. And then what feeds conspiratorial thinking more than secrecy, right? The Jews control everything trope. So this is around the adaptability of different industries. So, like, Jews were often tailors in Eastern Europe, but we were barred from the clothing businesses in the US. And so we created department stores, right? Hollywood as well, right? I forget, there was whatever the entertainment or media business was at the time. I don't know what it was called, but we were barred from it. So Jews helped pioneer Hollywood, right? But what people see is they see Jews control everything. What they don't see is the story of we were we were told that we couldn't be part of society, and so we just like toiled and blood, sweat, and tears to try to build something else that we could be a part of. And like it ended up doing really well, and that's a huge blessing. But people
And
don't see that.
yeah, and as you wrote, we were pushed from country to country, and now we established our own country, and that is what people don't like about us as well.
Right. So the cold militaristic Israel trope versus, the survival mode of a besieged nation, right? So people see these, if you think about it from an American perspective, when was the last time Americans had a war on American soil? Like there was Pearl Harbor, but that didn't
And 9/11.
but these are isolated incidents, right? This is not a full-scale war. And so when Americans think of war, they do have a more detached kind of orientation to it. There's a bit of what I call safety privilege in America, where if we have a war with Afghanistan for 20 years, like that doesn't reach your doorstep. It's not like you go to the gas station and you know, you're going to have a bomb go off, right? And so there's a lack of appreciation for Israel's situation of being surrounded by groups committed to its destruction. And like psychologically, like, yeah, you're very protective when you know that countries around you that are trying to destroy you. And I think what Americans end up seeing is they're seeing all the defense systems and all of the pursuing of um, like avoiding chaos. But because they're lacking this backstory of if we do not do this, all of this falls apart. They're only seeing the coping strategy, right? They're not seeing the why underneath it.
Yeah. So um, let's go to your study that you recently performed. You wrote the research report called "Perceptions of Jews and Israel: Narratives of Anti-Semitism, Insights, and Strategies for Change," which can be found online. And I will also include it in the description of this episode, the link to that report. Who asked your firm to do this research and for what purpose?
So the short answer is no one asked. And
Mhm.
I'll give you the longer answer. So my background was in intelligence work, diplomacy work, and I was doing back channel diplomacy work until October 7th, kind of adjacent to Abraham Accords. I was working with lots of different countries in the Middle East, um, doing negotiating economics diplomacy projects. When October 7th happened, I, like many of us, sort of stopped in my tracks and was thinking, what can I do to immediately help in the situation? And so I had not oriented before how much America was on fire in this way. And so I thought, okay, let me take a bit of a break from what I'm normally doing. And I started off just by advising different Israeli spokespeople on how they spoke to media. I started doing that. And then I was asked to join some different coalitions of different Jewish and Israeli leaders who had skill sets around fighting propaganda, around radicalization and communications. And I ended up running research for one of these coalition groups. And I had thought that running research would mean aggregating research that existed and extracting insights so that people who are doing communication strategies can use them in this actionable way. So that was, to me, that's what my mandate was. I very quickly found out that there was almost no research
Mm,
that was done that could be used for that.
okay.
The bulk of research is indexing anti-Semitic incidents. It's tracking, are you on this team or that team? Like in a broad, national survey kind of way. And there was basically nothing that we were able to use to understand not just what is driving anti-Zionism, but what interventions are effective in changing hearts and minds. And that's qualitative work. Um, and so I ended up deciding to lead the first comprehensive study on this. I designed it, I fundraised for it. I'm very grateful to Phil Siegel was one of the biggest benefactors for this, without whom this could not have happened because it's very expensive to conduct research. Um, but but I wanted to make sure that this was done with all of the rigor so that this could be a laying of groundwork that every organization could use. So I got IRB credentials. This is Institutional Review Board credentials. This is the highest level of academic rigor you could have, where I can publish in a peer-reviewed journal for the results. Um, it's a longer story that I won't share right now, but it took a long time to get a professor to agree to sign off on this. I finally got one from University of Texas who would do it. Um, but I didn't hire a firm. I did everything in-house because the thing that people don't realize about research is even if you're recruiting in a way that's not as rigorous, it damages all of your results. So I wanted
Mhm.
to make sure that everything was in its purest form. So the
And
research itself, yes.
sorry, Tawa, to interrupt you, but so it was not the Jewish organizations, the big Jewish organizations in America, or the state of Israel that asked you to perform this research about the perceptions of Jews and Israel in the United States, right?
No, it
No,
was not. And it was after months of asking why they would not do it.
right. Um, and why did they not do it?
I've received different answers about this. I have my own opinions of that as well, but I think I, well, I guess what I would say is I think it's a combination of when people are in a hair on fire, like I mean, it is a bit of a trauma response. It's difficult to take a deep breath and take a step back and look strategically. So everyone wants to go into action immediately. So
Hmm.
people were willing to throw in millions of dollars into these different social media campaigns because they wanted to feel like the bar was moving. But the problem was without knowing what was impactful, a lot of those campaigns backfired,
Right.
right? And so it's this balance, right? Like I don't advocate for, doing research for years on end and never, implementing. Like that's the other extreme that's also, too slow. But, this only took 4 or 5 months. It didn't take that long.
Okay.
Um, yeah, and to do the actual execution of it. So yeah, and I think another reason is that we don't this is something I had not realized before this work because I was not in Jewish organizational life before. I was doing diplomacy work with Israel. I was not in Jewish org world. But what I had not realized is Jewish organizations don't really have the infrastructure where they're working with non-Jews. That's not really what they're designed for. So even when they're interested in the research, and everyone's interested in the research now, but they're not sure how to use it because the way their personnel is dedicated and the initiatives they focus on, it's not Jews speaking to external audiences.
Okay.
It's, Jewish community speaking to the Jewish community.
Okay.
And so part of it is people don't know how to actually leverage it in practice because the organizations are not designed for that.
So it's hard to fight anti-Semitism if you don't speak with non-Jews. But
That's right.
okay.
Nachon.
And you used focus groups, right?
So it was multi-layer. It's focus groups, ethnographic research, interviews, and social media discourse analysis.
Okay. So what views do Americans have about Jews and Israel, in the positive and in the negative category?
Yeah, so I always like to ask people this. Let's play a game. If you had to guess oh, actually, you read the report, so this might not be fair, but we'll play this anyway just for fun.
Mhm.
Okay. So what would you normally have thought would be the most beloved trait of Jews in the eyes of Americans? If Americans said, this is the best, my favorite thing about Jews, what would it have been?
For Americans, I would think the many contributions Jews have made to American society in the sense of, for instance, in science, in academics, in developing businesses, in philanthropy.
So this is the answer I get for probably 90% of Jewish people who I ask. This is what we think. This is what we assume. It basically didn't show up at all. And this is one of the findings is that we're in this huge echo chamber because I was shocked constantly by the research that I was collecting. So the most positive traits were humor, family values, and resilience. Now, there were other traits that showed up very positively, but so for example, tight-knit community, that was another positive trait. But the problem with tight-knit community is you have the negative flip of the coin of insular, right? Um, Jews being successful, that was a trait I heard a lot, but it carries a lot of the conspiratorial thinking often about it. So it has this downside. So the three positive traits that have really almost no downside to them are the humor, family values, and resilience. Um, in terms of, and I was alluding to this earlier, depending on the demographic, um, there were certain traits that could be considered positive or negative. So I mentioned for Latinos, Jews being successful was a positive because it implicitly to them it meant hard work. Whereas in the Black community, this implicitly meant something conspiratorial or nefarious. Um, the thing with both for Jews and Israel is that, most Americans will never meet a Jewish person. Maybe they'll meet someone, but like they will almost never have a close relationship with a Jewish person. They're more likely to know a Jewish celebrity, though, right? Israel, people will never meet an Israeli person, and they probably can't name an Israeli celebrity either. The reason why I bring up celebrity is that celebrities are a way of creating a people feel a personal connection to someone who they don't know. So even if you're in a situation where, people are not going to meet a Jewish person or an Israeli person, if there's celebrities that are really loved and well known that are Jewish and Israeli, they're kind of playing that peer role where they're making this personal connection overall. So for the Israel side, because there aren't even Israeli celebrities that people are really familiar with, I mean, some people knew Gal Gadot was, but most people didn't. So what happens is most of Americans' exposure to Israelis as people are governmental spokespeople. That's what they're exposed to. What's the problem with that? The problem is that governmental spokespeople are trying to convey the details of war. They are undergoing horrible trauma, like in parallel with doing their jobs, right? There's people whose like families were held hostage and then they have to go on BBC and give a statement. It's like an unbelievable thing for someone to have to do. And, how do people keep it together when they're feeling emotional? You shut down your system. So they come across, and this is what Americans said, they come across as cold, callous, uncaring, unfeeling. So it's a it's a huge, huge, huge problem to have, for the Jewish perceptions, we have a little bit more flexibility because people have more entryways of understanding who Jews are. There's different Jewish celebrities. So if there's a problem with how one Jewish celebrity is acting, at least we have some other ones. But for Israeli perceptions, people are never going to meet an Israeli person, and they're probably only going to know about Israelis from the spokespeople on TV. So this makes it like super, super concentrated. Um, and so I think something else I want to mention is something that came up a bunch in the research was there were certain negative traits that people would say about Jews that traditionally Jewish organizations would call anti-Semitic and try to, deplatform or cancel people for. But what I found was that there are certain traits that were negative, but were not vilifying. They were negative, but they were not vilifying and they were not conspiratorial.
For
And
instance,
yeah, so this was really interesting. So, for example, so like, here, let me pull this up. So, um, So, for example, when it comes to being really this idea of like being really unwilling to integrate into American society kind of thing. So that's something people say about many different groups. It's not just Jews, it's many different groups. And so what we started tracking is like, or like, okay, Jews are a lot in this profession. So if someone says Jews control Hollywood, they control all the power, that's conspiratorial. But if someone says there's a lot of Jews in Hollywood and they also think there's a lot of Latinos in dental work and a lot of Koreans in dry cleaning shops, um, you know, being able to identify what is dangerous and conspiratorial versus what's just like humans noticing patterns, right? And so the litmus test that I devised for this in terms of how to know if something is dangerous and conspiratorial is, does it apply to a bunch of other groups? One. And two, is there a positive upside to the negative trait? So, like, if Jews control all the power in the world, it's not really a positive upside to that. Like, it's pretty much just evil, right? But if Jews are really, if the idea is Jews are really stingy, let's say that one. I mean, I can count like the amount of groups of people who are considered stingy in America. I mean, it's like most of them, right? Um, and so if someone says Jews are stingy, but I respect that they're good with their money, that's something that applies to other groups, and they've acknowledged a positive upside. So that kind of screening mechanism is really important because there are times that are anti-Semit that when we're fighting anti-Semitism, we're not focusing enough on the dangerous conspiratorial aspects and we're painting things with a broad brush. And the problem with that is that it feeds into this stereotype that Jews are trying to control the narrative and control information, especially if the thing that the person said doesn't land in people as actually being vicious. It really tends to backfire. So there's a whole litmus test in the research that I encourage people when you're talking to people, like, is this just a trait that they might say about another group that it's fine that people have some general associations, or does it really innately lead them to thinking that Jews are evil? And there's usually a pretty big distinction.
Okay. What let's go to the anti-Israel um, communication that we are all coming across these days in different communication channels. You talk in your report about the anti-Israel propaganda machine. What is that? Who are they? How do they operate? What are their tactics?
So, the anti-Israel propaganda machine, I thought a lot about what to call this because I wanted people to understand that this idea of it being a machine or a network, like it's a very established entity, but it's also really disparate. So, for example, you have um, the core features of this of like Hamas and Iran and Qatar and their bot farms in Malaysia and Indonesia. Like you have all of that. But then you also have places like Russia and China that don't care about Israelis or Palestinians, but they see this as a really good way to destabilize the US, or they see this as a really good way to divide a wedge in
Mhm.
society, or to, if like we see this a lot for Russia trying to, and you see this at protests, a lot of the signs turning into like, you know, defunding the military, ending military aid to every country. So, like, this is intentionally a country like Russia trying to weaponize this so that Ukraine doesn't get, like, if Israel doesn't get aid, we can get Ukraine to not get aid. So, so the thing about the anti-Israel propaganda machine is that it does not just consist of groups that vehemently hate Israel. It also has a lot of groups that are cynical and opportunistic. And so when those two things come together, when they converge, the amount of resources is exponential that's added to this, right? So you have many different layers of this. I mean, I think the academic front, I think, is pretty well known at this point, the amount of money that, places like Qatar are sending into American universities. And you can see very clearly the correlation between the amount of funding that comes from Gulf states with the amount of anti-Israel sentiment on campus. It's like, it's pretty highly correlated.
And so,
Um,
but all these different elements of this propaganda machine are not necessarily coordinating with each other, is what you're saying. Is that
so
correct?
That's correct. So the
Okay.
parts that are coordinated, when you look at pro-Palestinian protests, that's highly coordinated. Like people, student groups, they will get, and because I've seen these, I've gotten these. They will get Google Doc manifestos of exactly what slogans to use, exactly how to do your protest, exactly how to do your encampment. This is how you deal with campus security. This is how you deal with the campus governance. Like it's all standardized.
And
This is what we're seeing. Yeah.
who's giving that to the students?
So this is so these groups are, I mean, they're funded not just by countries in the Middle East, they're also funded by some philanthropists in the US as well. In terms of who's doing it, this goes through a few different organizations. that because there's a few different organizations like, Students for Justice in Palestine, things like that.
Mhm.
There's a few different organizations that they're routed through, but
Okay.
that's more of a like routing structure. I think the heart of the question is like how much of this is grassroots versus how much of this is strategic and by design, right?
Mhm.
I think that's
Yeah.
really what your question is. And so when I say that things are sort of disparate, I do not mean as it relates to pro-Palestinian protests and propaganda, like grassroots propaganda. So when it comes to school boards, state legislatures, student protests, so these are like in-person grassroots efforts, highly, highly, highly centralized and coordinated. The pieces that I'm saying are, you know, cynical actors are playing in as well. That's more of social media. That you see a lot more for social media and disinformation because they're opportunistic in trying to magnify problems. They're not like it takes so much strategy to do grassroots on the ground. Like that's usually coming from folks that are more directly connected to Hamas and Qatar and places like that. So that's really coordinated. But then you have this exponential um, increase of exposure of that when you have, for example, like TikTok. We were doing a whole study on this for, um, the amount of hashtags, pro-Palestinian hashtags on TikTok versus Instagram or places that are not owned by China, for example. And it was like, 10 times more on TikTok, right? So China has an like because they've decided that this is really good for geopolitics is to do this. But that's different than them trying to go to like school boards and things like that. They're doing
Yeah.
this on the digital front. Yeah.
Okay. And how do they operate this anti-Israel propaganda machine? How does it operate? What are their tactics?
Yeah. So one of the big ones that, and I think this is their Achilles heel if we're able to actually get our minds around this, one of the big ones is they're really good at convincing Americans, and not just Americans, convincing the world to conflate people in government. So, something I talk about is the employment of archetypes. So this sort of machinery that, and this is very like this came from Hamas originally, but this strategy of we're going to have Palestinian people are this innocent people, and then we have the government, which is like this anti-hero, right? It's like we have to be ugly because Israel is so ugly. The only way to go up against it is to be even more awful and more violent. And this really catches fire in a place like America where we have so much rising contempt and distrust and hatred toward institutions. Whether you're on the left or the right, we have lots of examples of anti-heroes in American political culture. And so what this means, though, is that they're able to rile up people who are angry about domestic issues and make Israel a symbol. So, like, you're angry at the Supreme Court around immigration, you're angry, you want to defund the police, you want to support indigenous rights. Well, this is just like that. Oh, you're angry at capitalism? Well, Israel's just the epitome of capitalism. And so they're able to leverage people's anger in that way. And it's so clever because, and what we started off this conversation saying was that what we have to do is attune to the audience. So what we do is we say, hey, Americans, you should really care about us. But that's not what the other side does. The other side says, Americans, what do you already care about? What are you already angry about? And we're going to make Palestinians and Israel the epitome of those things. So they're doing amazing attunement work. But what they do though is they're also differentiating between people and government. So the people in America who are not motivated as much by anger, who do not think that it's justified to, rape and torture people for the pursuit of justice, quote unquote. Um, but but for them, there's still this differentiation of people and government. So then they're not going to blame the Palestinian people for what Hamas did. So it's a really robust strategy where you get to capture different, you get to capture Americans' anger and violence, and then you get to inoculate the Palestinian people from being responsible for that. So in turn, what they do is they conflate Israeli people and government. So for the Palestinian archetypes, they have the innocent victim and the anti-hero, so two different ones. For Israel, it's the king or the ruler, and it's one. So what does that mean? That means, so, the king and the ruler, this is like, if you do one thing wrong, you fall from grace and you're a tyrant. It's a really, really risky archetype to have. And what's so convenient that the other side does is when they point out anything that the Israeli government does that Americans might not agree with, oftentimes because Americans don't have the context of what's happening, what they'll do is they'll say, this is Israel. Israeli people and government, one and the same. This is why you get Jews and Israelis being attacked and boycotted because they're conflating the two. And this is very intentional. And so on our side of things, one of the most important strategies is to distinguish between people and government. Because as soon as you start to distinguish between people and government, you find that they spend so much money, they have so much mobilization. But if you can get people to start saying, but that's the Israeli government, right? That's not the people, right? Something totally changes because Americans, we live in a very polarized time in America where half of the population hates who's going to be president, whether it's this president or the previous president. Half of Americans are really angry about it. So they have this appreciation of, well, I don't want to be seen as the same as my government, right? And so as soon as you start helping people understand that people and government are separate, it means that all of the vilification, it doesn't apply to the people as much. And what this means is we're shifting then from an existential anti-Zionism to more of like a policy debate anti-Zionism, which I know does not sound super cathartic, but it's actually very much in the right direction because what we emotionally want is for Americans to just support Israel and say, Israel's doing the right thing. We see you, we understand you, we support what you do. That's what we want because that feels really good.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth is, for us to strategically win, we don't actually need that. What we need is to have the strategic partnerships in government and business, which we already had. And then we have to demobilize the anti-Israel sentiment that makes it really hard for those strategic leaders to do those strategic alliances. So the reason why we're losing speed in government is that lawmakers don't want to be voted out by their constituents. And they're afraid of being voted out because their constituents have been mobilized into hating Israel. But the truth is, if you can get most Americans to say, I don't know, it's just really complicated over there. I don't know what's happening. If you can get them to disengage, strategically, we'll have the alliances that we need because pragmatically, the US, business leaders and government want to work with Israel. It's a gen pop problem, right? It's a general audience problem.
But
So, yeah.
yeah, but does that mean then that the Jewish community should say in public, we don't agree with the policies of the Israeli government?
So it's interesting that you ask this. The way I would say this differently is us as individuals who are trying to help people understand Israel, we are not spokespeople for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, right? So if you're a spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you have to defend every single policy, every single move. But we, as just Jewish Zionists, all we're trying to do is get people to understand who we are and why we do what we do. And so instead of focusing on the what, the policy, the war strategy, the action, that's something that the government has to defend. We don't have to defend that. All we have to defend is we want people to understand the spirit and the heart of Jews and Israelis and the difficult situation that we're in. And like, there aren't a lot of good options and we're doing our best. Right. And that's the most winning strategy that the government can't take that stance, but it's the most compelling stance to Americans. And we as individuals can do that work. And the problem is when we try to represent the government, we come across as what? Defensive, cold, stoic, right?
I think that is really good advice for each of us to focus not so much on the policies, even if we get those argued against us, but to focus on the hearts and minds of Israelis and try to win the hearts and minds of the people who are criticizing Israel. so harshly, to make them understand what the situation of Israelis is in general in these current times. Correct? Am I
Yes.
summarizing correct?
No,
Yeah.
you are. I'll give you just a few different takeaway points for people to think about, to
Hmm.
reflect on at home. So tell personal stories. Don't have political talking points. Talk about your family's experience. Help people understand why Israel needs to exist. What does it mean to you and your family?
Hmm.
So tell personal stories. Humanize instead of over explaining. So instead of defending the specifics, which Americans don't know what's happening over there, right?
Hmm.
There's a huge knowledge gap. So
Hmm.
instead of that, you want to humanize around we're terrified and don't want our children to wake up with a knife on their throat in the middle of the night,
Hmm.
right? Like that's poignant. You show emotional attunement and resonance, not righteousness. So, like, you don't want to prove the person you're talking to wrong. You want them to understand. So, if you think about this when someone's debating, I was a debate champion when I was younger, and it's great because the people who are voting on who won is the audience. But when you're debating someone, the person who decides if you've won or not is the person you're debating with. So like attacking them is counterproductive, right?
Hmm.
It doesn't matter about being right. It matters about them emotionally connecting. Um, and so I think rehumanizing through these micro moments of real stories, telling real stories. And the last thing I would just say is be a mirror, not a megaphone. Okay. So like when I say be a mirror, find out if someone's saying things that are anti-Israel, be curious. Like, where is this coming from? Because it probably has nothing to do with Israel. It probably has, there's probably some sort of domestic, um, political, um, grievance that they have. And this is like a feather in their cap because it's been adopted kind of, as just another example of this original thing that they cared about. So get to the bottom of what do they actually care about and what can you validate about what they actually care about? And then you start to detangle Israel as being the symbol of that, right? So that these are sort of my um, best sort of bullet points of what to consider just for
That's
viewers at
wonderful.
home.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that. That's very valuable for all of us. So, this brings us to the end of this interview. Are there any things we haven't covered that you feel are important to share?
I think I think the thing I would just like to say to end this is people will give you so much grace for the what if they connect with the who and the why. So Americans might not agree largely because they don't understand what it's like to have a war in close borders, but they might not understand actions that Israel's taking in the war. But if you can get them to understand who Jews and Israelis are, our heart, our values, if you can get them to understand viscerally the why, the terror, the fear, the grief, if you can get them to connect on that, they're not going to argue as much on the what. And you can shift it to something around actual connection.
That's great advice. Um, Thank you, Toba, for sharing all your amazing insights with us in this interview. And I also thank our listeners. If you want to know more about this podcast, please visit our Never Again Is Now podcast channel on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and iHeart. And please, whenever you can, speak up against anti Semitism and all hate.